Okay. So, good evening everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the third talk of the year of the Oxford Society of Metaphysics. We are very happy to have Professor Ingthorsson with us, who is going to give a talk about his new book about McTaggart's paradox. I would like to say some words about our speaker and how the evening will be structured. So, he is an associate professor in philosophy at Helsinki University. He is originally from Iceland, but educated in Sweden, and have taught and conducted research in the UK, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. His area of specialization is metaphysics. More specifically, the core issues in metaphysics of time, causation, persistence, powers, process, and truth. The views that he defends are presentism, which is not only the present exists, but the future is not yet, and the past is no longer. Endurantism, things endure rather than PERDURE. Powerful particular views of causation. So causation is the interaction between powerful particulars. Causal theory of constitution and persistence. Compounds are constituted by causal interactions between component parts, and persistence is a measure of how long they are so constituted. Compound particulars are both substances and processes. And identity theory of properties. Properties are both qualities and powers. And finally, correspondence theory of truth. He's also interested in questions having to do with the application of metaphysics to our understanding of science, so including humanities and social sciences. So I'm now turning you over to Valdi, who will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to the Q&A section for around 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that long introduction. I get surprised that I've written about all that. Anyway, so I'm here to talk about McTaggart's paradox. And it takes me a little bit to be talking about this here in Oxford, because I wrote the book about McTaggart's paradox when I lived here in Oxford between 2010 and 2015, using the Broadline library and stuff. To talk about him here in Oxford is very, very nice. Now this guy might be one of those who has, let's say, influenced most philosophy, both with respect to conceptions, but also misconceptions about time. In fact, you might think that, or say that 20th century philosophy of time would not have been the same without him, and I hope to be able to explain why and how. In particular, perhaps try to explain why the argument doesn't deserve the reputations for being obscure and difficult. I think it was really received in the wrong way from the beginning as a self-contained and independent piece of reasoning. It didn't rely on any contentious ontological principles. So if we move on forward, I think one of the reasons why it was received in that way was because the first version of the argument, which came out in 1908, was presented in a German article. And there he doesn't say too much about his own metaphysical system, maybe because he was quite well known at the time and didn't think he needed to say to his audience that he was Hegelian, obsessed with the absolute and so on. They might have guessed that themselves. But if he's unclear in the first version, he makes up for that when it reappears again in 1927, and then as chapter 33, which is the first proper chapter of the second volume of his Manual of the Nature of Existence. And there in that volume he makes it abundantly clear that the argument is meant to be dependent on the metaphysics that he presents in the first volume. He's really just drawing out in a deductive fashion certain consequences of his metaphysics in that book. But still today most commentators just go straight for the original version of the argument and don't really bother with his metaphysics. And so what I'm going to do is to first very briefly sketch the structure of the argument. There are three parts to it. And then we'll go into each part in more detail. And I'll pretend that this has nothing to do with his metaphysics, and then we'll get to a certain step where he seems to make a big leap, and we'll wonder, how did he do that? Isn't there something more that needs to be said? And then I'll go back to the metaphysics, point out certain premises that he has, and then we go back to that leap and see how it really plays out, right? So the first part of the argument is really a phenomenological analysis of how time appears to us in experience or in thinking. It's not just in experience or in sensory perception. And this is where we get the famous so-called A series and B series. And they're derived from the observation that time appears to us in the form of events that stand in some temporal positions, rather future, present, or past, and continuously moving in that fashion. And we can, from that experience, in a way, abstract an idea of a series of positions from future to present to past. And that's what he calls the A series. But on the other hand, the events are also, the same events that are in A series are also earlier or later than each other, and that seems to be independent of the future, present, past. If two events are earlier and later than in the future, they're still going to be that when they're past. Okay? Stay put in those positions. And that's what he calls the B series. And this terminology has been used throughout the 20th century to say, what's your view? Well, I think that time is like a combined A and B series, just like McTaggart's described it. Time is like it appears to be, basically. There is objective tense, there is previous present, or it was believed that McTaggart said that the present is previous. He didn't really say it, but it's been believed that he did. And then there's something called tense passage, although that's probably a kind of metaphorical description. And there's earlier, later, and also. So the A theory, so-called, thinks that time is like this, like McTagart described it. But those who take the so-called B theory, they say, no, the A series is not real. There's no tense, no passage, there's no previous present, all times exist in characters that the only temporal features are earlier, later. And so in that sense, McTaggart really set down what the dispute was about. Is an A theory or B theory correct? Okay? And gave them the terminology to formulate their views on that. And that part has been basically accepted as good and true. There's no controversy really about this part of the argument. And even after Prior, who then developed tense logic, he bases his logic on McTaggart's analysis. So modern tense logic is derived from McTaggart's analysis. Then in the second part of the argument, he asks, well, is a conception of time as just a B series without the A series, is that good enough for a conception of time? And he says, no. Because there's no change in the B series. And although this is still the main objection to the B theory, it's really always been believed that McTaggart's argument for that point isn't very good. It makes certain simple mistakes here. The focus here isn't on that part of the argument, but I'm going to at least say that I think that's a mistake to think that he made these mistakes. His argument is basically the same as people have today against the B theory. And then in the third part, he asks, well, can time be like an A theory, since the B series on this known is not enough? Or I should have said, with McTaggart, is it like an A series? And then he answers, no. Because there's a contradiction involved in our conception of time as an A series. And it's the nature of that contradiction that has basically split philosophy into two. So either people think that McTaggart is correct about parts 1 and 2, but completely wrong about 3. Those are the atheists. And or on the other hand, he is completely right about 1 and 3, but not about 2. Okay? And in fact, there's a recent survey out from Phil Papers that 2,500 philosophers answered a survey about what they believe about time. And it's basically split 50-50. Those that are in the kind of B theoretic camp and those on the A theoretic camp. Okay. State of play. So we're going to try to understand what exactly is going on in this contradiction. How are we meant to get the contradiction here? And that's not going to be easy because, as I said, philosophers are split into two, and if you read the literature on McTaggart, you get all kinds of interpretations. And so much so that Judith Jarvis Thompson in 2001 says that if you look at the literature, you'll come away with the sense that the argument is basically like a Rorschach plot. You can read anything out of it. Or she puts it more poetically. So the first part now, the phenomenology. And this is basically what I've said earlier. From the subjective perspective, time appears to us in the form of events, and it's not that they appear in perception. We don't perceive the future. We perceive the present, but when we see something as present, we always have an anticipation of future, and we remember the past. So in a way, the way we perceive the world in that wider sense of cognitive sense, there's always this awareness of future, present, past, and continuous kind of change. Okay. And if this was really all that McTaggart had said, he would not have said anything new. There would be nothing original. This is the same as what Augustine said in 350 AD. It's the same as what Reid said in the 19th century. Same as what Husserl said, what Russell said, what Sohn said. Everyone said this, right? The originality is in a second step that it takes. And that is to really ask then, well, if this is how it appears to be, what must we assume about the world? How must the world be, objectively speaking, in order for that conception to be true? Then we have to really remove the observer, the subject has to go away. So how can we construe the A series as an objective series? And then he says, well, we have to assume that there's something outside of time. Because now we don't have an observer, right? Something must be outside of time that stays put and doesn't go from future to present to past, but in relation to which everything else goes from future to present to past. Now he doesn't say it's the present or the now or anything else. He says it's something. And said that to find something like that would be difficult. He thinks this is a problem, actually. But he grants, in a way, that. Let's assume that there are these primitive relations of future, present, past, because we'll get a problem later. Okay. But this means that the A series is, in a way, as he calls it, determined by a relation to something outside of time. The ontological basis for the series is in that relation to something outside of time. That makes it very different from the B series, because the B series doesn't depend on anything outside of it. The relations hold between the things in the series. Okay. And that's how you can, in a way, pry them apart. You kind of, in two different ontological models that you have. Okay. And even though, of course, in the A series, the steps are also going to be early later than. This allows us to think that maybe the early later than can be pried away from the A series. And this is what allows later thinkers to say, our model is this, the Rögnvaldur model is that, and it turns out to be an objective model, not dependent on the observer kind of model. I think that's the original part of the phenomenological analysis. So now the second part then. Okay? No change in the B series. And here we get to a difference between the two versions of the argument. In the first version, he just says, well, there's no change in the B series. Nothing changes in the position in the B series. If something ever is earlier than something else, it always is. Nothing is ever first earlier than something, and then later it's later than that, same thing. It used to be earlier than. And for a lot of people, this is weird. That's not what change is about. It changes about things changing properties, not of events changing positions in time. So it seems as if there's an obvious objection, and push forward that. And this is Nathan Oakland voicing that opinion. You can find the same objection really in any of the commentators that defend McTaggart. Mellor says the same thing. So they say that McTaggart argues that events do not change and concludes that there is no change in the B series, but that follows only if events are the only things that can change. The standard reply to McTaggart is that change can occur in the B series because it's substances or things that can change. Events are changes. They don't themselves undergo change. It's like absurd to think that you have to make change to get change. Unfortunately, this is just the result of not reading McTaggart's Metaphysics, okay? Because by event it doesn't mean a change. They're assuming that there is this ordinary kind of difference between an object that exists over time, but then if I flex it, the book changes, okay? And that's an event in our ordinary sense. But that's not what he means. An event for him is a substance. Okay? And it's really the state of the book at a given time, that's an event. And that's a very familiar conception today in so-called Kim-style events, particularly with the property at a certain time. And so they're changed states. So to get the change, you have to have lots of different events in succession. And you can push a bit, there's that object, but yeah, I can go on. And really need now to think of how McTaggart's thinks about persistence. And it's best to, in a way, compare with the two different models about persistence. On the one hand, things endure, that's a technical term today, when you think that objects are like three-dimensional objects that, in a way, pass from one time to another as wholes. Right? You can flip 2 times. So, yeah. So now we think that the object that's purple there is exactly the same object that used to be green. It's no longer green, it's now it's purple. But to allow yourself of that kind of conception of persistence, you have to allow time to pass. Something has to be able to pass. And if you say that all times exist in parity, they don't. You know, if you deny as you do if you accept the B series as a fundamental feature. So if you accept the B series, you're really committed to say that if an object exists many times, it exists at them all. And then you have to assume that, well, there must be different paths to the object. So it's different paths that exist at different times, and the different paths have different properties, so the paths don't change, so neither does the whole really. It might, to the subject that sees them in succession, it might get the illusion of change. And this kind of argument is in, first of all, in the first volume of Nature Existence, and then in the second version of the argument he discusses this explicitly. There's a bit of a puzzle why commentators have insisted on keeping that objection when he really is addressing it. And I'm not going to say too much more about that part of the argument. You can flip one page, and this is really to say that the argument in the later version is really that objects don't change because they are sequences of successive unchanging states, and those states don't change their position in the time series. So our only hope is that they might go from future to present to past. Okay? So that moves us to the question, well, can the A series be real? And this is supposed to illustrate the vertigo that people get when they are reading about the paradox. Okay. And initially, the paradox is presented in a very simple and almost naively simple way in these 3 claims. Right? So, first, it's the premise that future, present, past are incompatible properties. Nothing can be future, present, and past. Have to be just one at a time. But in time as a whole, eventually, everything will have more. Everything that is future will be present and past. If it is present, it has been future, will be past. If it's past, it has been present and past. Okay? And there's a contradiction that M is future, present, and past. And this is where you get the weird step. The 3 doesn't follow from 1 and 2, does it? Not automatically, at least. Okay? And here, in a way, people's intuitions tend to go apart. That either think that, well, there's something here, and then the argument that follows convinces them that, yeah, there is a problem. Or they think this is just bonkers, and what follows is just bonkers, more bonkers. Okay? And McTaggart knows this. He anticipates that we're going to react weirdly to this. Okay? So he gives us a solution. So he says, it's never true, or this is what we are supposed to say, right? It's never true, the answer will run, that M is present, past, and future. It is present, will be past, and has been future. And then he says, the characteristics are only incompatible when they're simultaneous, and there's no contradiction to this in the fact that each turns all of them successively. And now, what's the problem? Right? He's just given us a solution. But this is more tricky than it seems, because we have to wonder, is he really admitting to this? Right? Is he agreeing that they're only incompatible when they're simultaneous? Or is he just telling us what the objection is, but not agreeing to it? Okay? If we think that this is what he admits, everything that follows would have to be read as an attempt to show that they have them simultaneously, and you're going to find out that doesn't look as if he shows us that. But if you are open to the possibility that he's actually going to tell us that there's a problem even if they have them successively, you have to consider more options. Okay? And I want to try and show you that if you look at the premises from his metaphysics, he's not trying to tell us that they're simultaneous. It's a problem even if they're successful. But I think we can now at least understand the kind of incommensurability of views between the A theories and the B theories here in this fictive tower, which still has some basis in reality. Okay, this is from the literature about it. So we're supposed to start with the assumed contradiction: M is future, present, and past. And then the A theory says no, M has been future, is present, will be past, no problem. And then the B theory says, having read further on in McTaggart, no, you mean M is futurely present, futurely past, presently present, and pastly future, all at the same time. And then the B theory says, no, I didn't say that. I said, it has been future in the past, will be present in the present, or is present in the present, and will be past in the future. No problem. And then the B theory goes again, you mean it's pastly future in the past, presently present in the present, and futurely past in the future. And then the atheist says, you're being silly. I didn't say that. Am I? What you did is to always invoke tense to explain away the contradiction, and then you just repeated the same over again. Okay? You recreated the paradox on a higher level. And then the atheist says, no, I didn't. I was trying to show you that it was wrong to begin with M is future. We were never in that position. Right? So why should I have to solve something that wasn't the problem from the beginning? Not to be that is present, has been future, will be past. So they're disagreeing on where to start, okay? And the literature gives us the impression that people are just repeating these arguments against one another, and nobody thinks the other has a case. They're just voicing opinions, no arguments, okay? And what we now have to begin to appreciate is that while McTaggart in the first version does talk both about the vicious circle, and that's involved in the, if you apply tense to resolve tense, you get a normal problem. And he talks about an infinite regress. Right? And here it sounds on the B theorist that the vicious regress is a result of circularity. But it's not clear that McTaggart argues that in the first paper, because he also says that, well, maybe this circularity just shows us that the tense is primitive and fundamental. And we're not supposed to be able to analyze our fundamental notions. Okay? That would be to just show that they are not fundamental. So in the second version, he doesn't say a word about circularity. He just says there's an infinite regress and points out particularly that difficulty does not arise from a circularity. So at least he has some other argument in mind than the B theorist defenders or commentators. Okay? And our trick is now to show, well, how can we get the problem without appealing to the circularity? And of course, he's defined tense as this just primitive relation to something outside of time. Okay? He's really explained to us, almost in non-circular terms, what it is to be future, present, past. Yeah. So now I have to go back to the nature of existence and understand what's going on there in these two books. And yes, I told you he was a Hegelian and he was an idealist in the ontological sense. He didn't believe there was a material reality. There was only ideas or spiritual entities. Or he was an atheist, so it's not religious at all. But he was also a methodological idealist. And there are plenty of methodological ideas around today which are not idealists in the other sense. Okay. And that just means that he thinks that when we're doing metaphysics, we're looking for the ultimate structure, the most general feature of everything. Right? And to find that, empirical research won't help us because we can only observe the particulars, and we can only observe a handful of particulars here on Earth. We can't observe everything in the universe, and from that limited sample, we can't infer to everything. So this is a problem of induction. So our only hope is to go straight for the general concepts, what it is to exist, to be real, and so on. So that means that you have to do it a priori, before or independently of experience. And the first volume is explicitly his attempt to build a metaphysical system entirely on a priori reasoning. Okay. And then in the second volume, he kind of opens his eyes to certain salient features of experience, notably that everything appears to be in time, some things appear to be material, and there appear to be what he calls sensa, In a sense, are these sensible ideas, Locke would call them, or today maybe qualia would be the closest approximation. And he develops the argument for the unreality of time, matter, and sense. Okay? It's only the time argument that's been famous. Okay. But it's very clear that it means that he's basically just deductively demonstrating that if the results of the first volume are true, you can't have time or materiality and so on. Okay? And this is just to give you a little bit of textual evidence that this is what he explicitly says. And this is from the introduction to the second volume. He says more or less exactly the same in the introduction to the first volume. And then there's a chapter 3 in the first volume called Method, where he goes into all the details and explains to us this is what he's going to do. So the remainder of his work will have a different object from the first volume. So far we have endeavored to determine the general nature of the existence by arguments which require no empirical data. But now we have to inquire what consequences of theoretical or practical interest can be drawn from the general nature of the existent with respect to various parts of the existent which are empirically known to us. And he ends by saying it would be possible to show that having regard to the general nature of the existent has previously determined certain characteristics that we consider here for the first time cannot be true of the existent. So, and this phrase, having regard for the general nature, is repeated over and over and over again. Right? So it's abundantly clear that this is his intention. The time argument depends on this metaphysics. But what is this general nature of the existent? One, it's not too complicated, and secondly, it's not weird. These are premises that are, or principles that are accepted today. This is basically bog standard mainstream metaphysics today. Okay? And the first claim is that to be real is to exist. To exist is to be real, they can coincide. And that existence and reality has no degrees. Either something exists or doesn't, either something is real or isn't. Okay? Very simple. And then he continues that existence and reality is grounded in substances that possess properties in all relations. Some people might worry that substances here, hylomorphic Aristotelian substance, but very simple. It's just something that has properties, stands in relations. Nothing else, okay? And it's not reducible to just properties or relations. So even process ontologists can say that that kind of concept of substance could fit us also. And the only people that I can think of that would say no would be one category trope ontologists, those who believe that there are just property instances, there are no objects that have them. The idea that there are objects is just a bad inference from a cluster of properties that there's something that has the properties. And then the fourth is the idea that substances are individuated by their properties and the relations, really, that their identity is grounded in their properties. And again, that's just, consequence of Leibniz's law. And McTaggart explicitly discusses Leibniz and says that he chose a bad name for his indiscernibility of identicals and identity discernibles. He didn't say that there were identicals that couldn't be discerned. So better to call it the dissimilarity of the diverse. Yeah? To get the alliteration right, yeah. And not to get bogged into details, but it just means that wherever there is qualitative dissimilarity, there is numeric distinctness. Wherever there is numeric distinctness, there is qualitative dissimilarity. That's the idea. And again, if you read David Lewis's The Plurality of Worlds, you'll see these principles jump out of the text in just the first couple of pages. That's the starting point for him. Okay. There are complications for the first two, which don't need to go into here. Well, in fact, with Lewis it's quite alright, because the argument here is that there are no abstract entities for McTaggart. And he considers, so for something to be real but not existence is to be abstract. And for him, existence will be concrete existence, not abstract existence. So when he says to be real is to exist, is that there are no abstract entities, just concrete existence. Which is a bit weird since he's denying the reality of time, okay? And he's denying the reality of materiality. So what can he mean by concrete? And it's just that it's determinate, right? It has a determinate relation to everything else. And if something is abstract, there are certain things that are indeterminate. It doesn't have determinate position in space and time, for instance. Right? So there's some vagueness about what the abstract is. Anyway, so that's irrelevant. What's interesting is how can we get from this which everyone, or not everyone, but almost everyone assumes today, to unrelative time, and maybe some other good stuff. And to show you that he's not this old historical figure that you know, uninteresting, right? Is to show the parallel between more modern figures. And for McTaggart's, at least, he explicitly argues that if the future is real, it exists. If the past is real, it can only be real by existing. Okay? And since there are no degrees of existence, there's no privileged present. Right? The future, present, and past have to exist in exactly the same way. And that means actually that atheists have always been wrong to accept McTaggart's phenomenology. Right? They thought that the future, the present is privileged, but he said no, everything exists in parity. So he's already accepted the principle of temporal parity, which is what it's called today, on a priori grounds. Okay. Yeah. So his ontology was never good for the atheist, never. Okay. And yeah, so he argues, and Lewis does also say that the future exists just as much as the present, but he just said times are like other places, they're just not here now, right? They're just elsewhere, but they exist just the same. Okay. He doesn't point out how he arrived at that position. But they also talk about possibilities. Possibilities, if they are real, can only be real by existing, according to both. And since possibilities don't exist here, you know, if it's a real possibility that I could have been standing over there, but I actually don't stand over there, so it doesn't exist my standing there, then Lewis says, well, then therefore there have to be other worlds that exist in parity with ours, where me or my counterpart are standing over there. And that's the only basis for the possibility for it being, you know, me standing over there. And McTaggart goes the other way, says, therefore there are no possibilities, because I'm not standing there, and possibilities is just talk about what we don't know. It might rain tomorrow because I don't know whether it does or doesn't. It surely does rain or not tomorrow. Okay. So the same kind of basic principles lead us to reject the reality of time and to go modal realism, or can at least do that. Yeah. And now I think we're in a position to understand what the power is or how the argument goes, or why there is still a problem. Right? So we got first this M is future, present, and past, and then we want to know is present, has been, future, will be past, problem solved, and then McTaggart's yes, but what is meant by is and has been and will be. Okay? And now people have assumed that he's in a way drawing out something from language, right? That we're figuring out what we mean by the words, and he doesn't. He's ahead of the linguistic turn. The linguistic turn comes after him. He never says that because language means something, the world must be a certain way. Rather, it's the other way around. He says we can only model the world this way. So the only way in which our words can mean something real is because of the ontology. So the ontology predicts meaning or dictates meaning for the words. So these words here have to be interpreted as statements about something existing. It can't mean no longer exists or is going to exist but doesn't yet. That just doesn't make any sense at all. So M is present is pretty easy. M has the property of being present, and is here not the is of predication, not M is blue, but has to be used with the temporal meaning, because we have to compare it with has been and will be. And where are things that are? They are in the present. So M has presence in the present, or is located in the present. And has in future is M has the property in the future, but where are things positioned in time that have been? They're in the past. So M is future, but it's in the past. So at a different time, not simultaneously. Yeah. And will be past is has the property in the past, but in the future. Okay, so it's positioned in the future. So we have really a statement that says that M is in 3 different positions in time, future, present, past, and at those different times it has different incompatible temporal predicates. And because we have accepted the principle of temporal parity, all times exist in parity, then M is equally in all these positions. Just like we said that an object that persists over time has to be equally in all the different times if we accept the B series as the most fundamental feature. But we can't say simultaneity or simultaneous, because simultaneous means at the same time. And clearly M is not supposed to be all of them in the same time, but at different times. He does go on to also, add to the complexity by saying that once he's established this paradox, that there is another problem, which is that how can M be future in the past? Because being future is to be in this relation of futurity to something outside of time, and being past is being in an incompatible relation, and clearly here we have a simultaneity problem. How can it both simultaneously be future and past? How can it be past and future? It can be present and present, that's fine. Okay. So we get, in a way, a two-dimensional kind of paradox out of all of this. But it begins with the assumption that all times exist in parity. That's the a priori derived principle. I flip a couple of one more. Yeah. So now we can answer the question: is the A series contradictory? Yes, if we accept the principle of temporal parity. Yeah. So, and that's why B theorists who accept the principle of temporal parity, they see a contradiction, and they think that they prove that the A theory is impossible. But they can't use that argument to support their own position, right? Because then that's begging the question. They've already assumed the principle of temporal parity, and then they argue the A theory is impossible. Therefore, we have to accept the principle of temporal parity. They have to already first accept it. And if you reject it, as A theorists do, say no, it's only the present, or present is privy somehow, then it's not clear we get any contradiction at all. Yeah. So at least there's no intrinsic contradiction in the A theory if we decouple it from McTaggart's way of defining what the A theory is. And that's basically it. That's McTaggart's paradox. And now, I hope you're in a better position to evaluate whether you choose an A theory or B theory when McTaggart's paradox can really no longer be an argument in favor of one or the other. There must be other reasons to accept one or the other, relativity or something like that. Yeah. And McTaggart had no notion of relativity. In fact, he uses the absolute simultaneity in a universe-wide context to define time. Time is really all the temporal parts of all the objects in the universe that stand in relation to simultaneity. It's a universe-wide state. And yeah, he dies in 1925, before he had finalized it, but that's still, 15 years after, or more, after, Einstein came out with relativity theory. He had no clue of physics. So thank you. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much for the talk. So we will now open the floor for the question and answers session for around 10 to 20 minutes. Thank you.
So what was McTaggart's own perspective there? Did he reject both the A theory and the B theory, or did he either accept or deny temporal parity and therefore accept one over the other?
No, he rejected both, and then he realized that he needed to explain why we still have the illusion of passage and all that, right? And then he invented the C series. Okay, and the C series, and by the time he in a way says something more substantial about C series, he thinks he's already shown that reality isn't material, or everything is just ideas. So the C series is a sequence of ideas, but they're not sequence in that successive sense. They're rather in a way from the inside out. So if you have a first term in the series, that's an idea that doesn't include anything previous, but it's included in a later idea. And then the second idea includes this, and it's included in another, and then you get an inside-out organization of ideas. And from every state you have an anticipation is the kind of vague awareness of what this is included in and so on. Very Leibnizian, right? It's a similar explanation to kind of the monads and their internal, but that's also supposed to be an atemporal series. This doesn't really change, right? But as already was, Annie Oakley in the 1940s said, that doesn't really make any sense. You can't explain the continuous experience that we have just by these kind of fixed states, okay? Why do we seem to transcend from beginning to end through that sequence of stages? Okay. So that was his, and in fact, it's best to mention that today there's something called the C series in philosophy of time, modern theory, that says that there is no direction to time, right? And they use the term C series because they think that that's what McTaggart believed, but it didn't, because this C series that I've just explained has a direction. And it's a direction towards awareness. You're going to a greater and greater awareness of all the states. You end up in a Hegelian kind of complete awareness of all the states of everything. But there is a last stage. I don't know if I should. He develops this model to prove that there is more good than evil in the world. Okay. And how does he do that? Well, it's because he thinks that the development from no awareness to a greater and greater awareness of all the different cells in the universe is finite. So at some point we end up being aware of all our states, and we perceive other souls, and then we love each other, because love is a union of souls. And how bad that increment to awareness of everything and total love, how bad it doesn't matter how bad it is, because after you reach the top, there's an eternity of love and bliss, okay? And that part will always be greater than this bad before. So, unfortunately, there's no comfort for us, we will stay with the bad part.
You're really moving into theology then.
Yeah, but it's a completely atheistic. It's to God. It's the souls themselves that.
I mean, it sounded quite temporal when you were just saying.
Yes.
I was just wondering what was the because it does seem that he just assumes A theory is false from the get-go, or like Bacon's metaphysical assumption. It sounded like you said at the end also that he did the same with B theory, but I didn't quite catch. As in, does his argument assume B theory is false, or does he show the B theory doesn't work?
Well, I would say rather that his ideas or the principles that he has assumed beforehand, they coincide more with the B theory. The B theory also accepts that all times exist in parity. So I think actually that the B theory is in a worse state than the A theory from McTaggart's perspective, because they're accepted this basic principles. So they must accept that the B theory is this fixed series of sequences that doesn't change. And philosophers like Mellor have insisted that, because he's a B theorist, and he thinks that things can endure in B time, okay? And but the argument is more negative, that nobody has shown me that I can't assume that they endure in the B series, right?
But I thought things PERDURE in B series.
Most B theorists accept that, but not all.
Okay.
I mean, Mellor doesn't accept it, Peter Simons doesn't accept it, but they try to elaborate or give quite elaborate arguments as to why the arguments against it are inconclusive, and therefore they can continue to assume that things endure, even though the B theory is correct. I don't think these arguments work, but that's what they think.
Do you think you're an A theorist or B theorist?
That I am.
Yeah.
I hesitate because the A theory isn't really a single unified theory. The B theory is much more homogeneous, so to speak. There's this great variation between versions. But in the kind of group of A views or A theories, you have both the so-called growing block view that says there is no future, but there is a past, and in the present everything gets added continuously in the present. So that's a theory that said there's an objective difference between future, present, and past. But it's not the same as the so-called moving spotlight theory. that says really that there's a B theory or B series, but it's passing basically like it says from future to present past, passing through the present, and that used the metaphor of a spotlight, which originally was used by the Prof.
Is that a spot on an existing block, or the only thing that exists is the spotlight?
The spotlight is something outside of time that in a way lights up the present, and it's all metaphorical talk and recognized to be so, but there's still kind of, and I'm not sure actually that there's anyone that actually believes in it. There are books that are presenting the spotlight theory, but I think they're mostly just playing with the idea. It doesn't work, okay? And then the only one that I think might believe in the view that he puts forward, I would say it isn't really a moving spotlight theory. It's kind of, yeah, because he doesn't think that the present and the past actually exists. So it's more of a presentist view. And presentism is, in a way, a view that isn't either an A view, because it doesn't say that there's a future and a past. There's just the present. And so there is no passage from future to present to past. But then again, well, how do you explain that then, right? Now I happen to be a presentist, okay? But I'm struggling to formulate how exactly do we think of the so-called passage then? And my preferred way of saying this is to say, I mean, most of the presenters are talking about truths about the future and past and so on, and giving all kinds of explanations for that. But my preferred view say that, well, it has been assumed for a very long time that the universe in a way is made up of some limited amount, a very big amount of something, energy or matter or whatever, and that stuff you can't add to it, you can't take away from it, it's fixed, okay? All conservations, they assume this, right? So all they can do is transform from one state to another. And that would mean that you get, in a way, something stuck in the present, and then there are transformations of that stuff. And since they have to transform from one state to another, the previous states have to, in a way, cease to be, and the new states begin to be. Okay? But how to resolve that with the conception of relativity is a great puzzle. So you have, in a way, different parts of physics giving explanations that don't make any sense together. Physics of material stuff saying there's transformation of these states from one state to another, and then relativity saying, well, there's no previous present, right? So all times exist in parity. How do we get those parts of physics to fit together? And so far there hasn't been no focus on that. Either you go for relativity and then say the consequences of relativity are assumed to be the consequences of all of physics, which is to say there's no absolute now. And those ideas about stuff, they're just left to the side, okay? But as soon as you bring them in, it turns out not to be so easy to say that, just to be assuming relativity, you get all times existing pattern. And in fact, if you look at, Sabine Hosselander recently talked about this, and she's very careful not to say that all times exist pattern. She does at the beginning of the video that she's going to give you the answer, but she doesn't if you listen carefully. She just says that, well, there is this plane where things can be looked simultaneous from different perspectives, but there is the light cone that tells you that there are certain things that cannot be, from many perspectives, seen to be simultaneous. So there is a part of the past that just cannot absolutely be simultaneous, okay? And that means that you can't say that all times exist in parity. There are some things that might be in parity, but others cannot. So it's not clear that you can go from there is no absolute now to all times exist in parity. That's maybe a little bit too big of a leap.
I was just wondering, doesn't relativity theory, as in it seems like you're bringing in certain metaphysical assumptions that you're saying that it implies that there is no absolute simultaneity. But then there are different philosophical interpretations of relativity theory which aren't directly equivalent. Or you can just not be a space-time realist and say, oh, this is a useful mathematical tool, but it doesn't. Yeah,
I'm rather, in a way, challenging those who assume that there is one interpretation of that. Yes. And then rather saying, as you say, no, we can interpret that in different ways. which is to say, you can't go straight from relativity, assuming there's just one interpretation, and
Yeah.
you get this philosophical eternalist view. Yeah.
Well, as far as I understand it, there's a Lorentzian interpretation which is presentist and fits the data from that we have regarding.
Yeah, I've been told, yes, but I'm not really equipped to believe or disbelieve that. Yeah. Because I'm not a physicist.
You are a presentist, right?
Yes, yes.
So, as in, you must think there's some solution if you reject the B theory interpretation. Otherwise, you would not be a presentist, you'd be agnostic.
Well, I don't think it's impossible to wait until everything is completely proven, right? Because there just are incompatibilities and difficulties with all these views. So I can only say that I lean towards presentism because maybe I'm more concerned about how do we understand how do we understand change and persistence, and the B-theoretic idea of change and persistence doesn't make any sense to me. Okay? So I'm hoping for other people to solve the relativity problem. And maybe you say that someone has to solve it, or at least given one interpretation that fits. That would be wonderful. But I'm all for a division of labor. So I'm doing this McTaggart's stuff, and someone else does the relativity stuff. And at least it also serves a kind of a methodological role to in a way decide to defend presentism, because there are so few people who do it in a certain sense. But it's still that I'm leaning towards that, to presentism, because the other view makes less sense to me than that. But, I mean, but it's difficult. You can't be a presentist and not agree that there are lots of problems with it. And they're not just with relativity, but for instance, if you believe that there isn't a past, but you think it's true that there were dinosaurs, how can it be true if there are no dinosaurs to which the idea corresponds? Okay. And I'm there pushed to accept that actually it isn't true in the strictest sense. We can have a justified belief that there were dinosaurs, but it can't ontologically be true because there isn't something to correspond. But it seems that our knowledge about dinosaurs are still of the kind that we just have justified belief because we have these fossils in the ground and the theory of evolution. So for me it's okay that the criteria for being that have to be fulfilled for something to be true are just not there. Because I still think I can be justified in believing that dinosaurs are green or brown or whatever. But okay. And the same for the future. It's easy for the future because most people don't think that the future already exists. And then our claims about the future will be justified, but not true or false. Yeah, so those positions make sense to me. So do you think you understand McTaggart's argument for ground relative time now?
Just one last question, which is, well, maybe because I'm a physicist and it's not exactly related to McTaggart's paradox per se, but in your opinion, is it right to say that neither the A or B theories of time support time traveling?
Yes, I would say neither of them do, yes. And the B theory because of the problems of moving. But you can construe a PERDUREntist view of time traveling. Okay, not only that when Harry Potter goes back in time, right? He was really already laid out as a sequence of temporal parts in a loop. Okay, and that explains why he had already really seen himself before he then went back and but we would have to abandon the thing that he himself somehow is a unified thing that moves back.
Yeah, but that would make things more deterministic, I presume.
Yes. And that's one of the reasons I don't like that. Because you get the deterministic implication of these. I mean, but there's an industry literature about this time travel stuff, and I think actually that some have argued that you need some kind of theory, but not one of the ones that we already have. But somehow someone allows the flow to go a little bit, back and forth or something. And there are the branching theories as well, which are almost really another viewing altogether aside, right? So that's what philosophy does. You begin with one kind of distinction, and then someone finds another distinction from the distinction, and then you get a plethora of different views, of which very few make any sense, but they're funny and stimulating for literature and stuff. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so thank you very much everyone for coming to the talk. So unfortunately this is our last talk for the society for this term. So thank you very much for coming. So we will have more talks in Hillary term. I think we are still organizing it, and it will probably be on the topics on the topic of aesthetics, if I remember correctly. Anyways, we'll have more official announcements soon. So please stay tuned to our Facebook page and to our website. And we also have a YouTube channel as well. So please subscribe to it, and you can rewatch the lecture today and to understand more about the paradox. If you need to. If you need to watch it again. Anyways, so thank you very much.